Concrete comedy is the comedy of doing rather than saying. Its history amounts to an alternative history of 20th century comedy. Alternative to what? To mainstream comedy. Funny movies, funny TV shows, funny plays, the forms that usually occur to us when we think of comedy. Stand-up, sketch, and improv comedy, those are mainstream forms too. Mainstream comedies share three attributes. First, a mainstream comedy is verbal. It's funny lines spoken. Second, it's illusionistic. Those funny lines are spoken by characters in make-believe situations. Or in the case of stand-up, a comedian uses words to refer to offstage subjects that the audience pictures. Third, in mainstream comedy, some kind of story is being told, however brief, distorted, or fragmentary. Verbal, illusionistic, and narrative. That's mainstream comedy. Concrete comedy goes at comedy another way. Where mainstream comedy is verbal, concrete comedy communicates via objects and actions. And where mainstream comedy depends on pretending an illusion, concrete comedy is just as physically present and real as you are. You might think of it as nonfiction comedy. Things done for real, for their own sake, by people who are not characters in make-believe scenarios, but instead and only themselves, will always pack a greater existential wallop than will pretending. Concrete comedy taps the power of the actual. The difference is enormous. Lastly, where mainstream comedy tells a story, concrete comedy delivers concepts. Where did this alternative approach to comedy come from? Who's responsible? Karl Valentin was a German comedian active from around 1910 till the end of his life in 1948. He was enormously popular in Germany, and his output included stage plays, radio work, recordings, and films, stuff typical of comedians. Unlike other comedians, however, Valentin also made objects. A comedian who made objects, with comic rather than aesthetic intent. Here was something new. Here's Valentin's cold steam of an express train locomotive. Just a plain glass flask half filled with water, before which Valentin has placed a little card. We have something real. Here, some water in a flask, and we have the attitude toward it. In the final analysis, that's all comedy is, an attitude toward the real. Note how cold steam doesn't aspire to art's breadth of interpretation. This water in this flask is intended to be interpreted so. We sense that this is another class of object, akin perhaps to a prop. But where a theater prop supports a narrative that's already underway,
look out, he's got a prop!
In the case of cold steam, there is no narrative, no theater, apart from that which the object itself supplies. Cold steam of an express train locomotive isn't a prop, it is prop-like, a much more complex location, and an innovation. It would be closer to the mark to characterize what Valentin invented as comedy taken material form than funny art. Here are a few more of Valentin's objects. Here's one of my favorites. Valentin is drawing your attention to something in order to tell you not to pay attention to it. Pretty fancy comedy. Some of these objects are vulgar, some are refined, some are dumb, some smart. They display a tonal range, but they share a special comedic hum. And Valentin wisely perceived that hum would be inaudible within the context of an art gallery or art museum. So in addition to inventing a class of prop-like objects, he invented a context for them. He named this context his panopticon, and the first version of it, created in the early 1930s, was installed in the basement of the Hotel Wagner in Munich. Picture it, a dark subterranean realm removed from the buzz and bustle of life, a series of windowless rooms, absent compass and clock. In that setting, what above ground had seemed solid certainty, the distinction between real and imagined, the line between theater and life, dissolves a bit. Instead of telling stories, Valentin's comic panopticon offered a theater of material culture. The real flowed through those rooms in a way it has never flowed through any make-believe scenario. With the comic objects installed there, over time there would be more than 100. Valentin invents a category between life and theater. He's a major figure, both because he's the earliest link between comic performance and the production of objects, and because he formally recognized comedy's evolutionary leap by establishing a context dedicated to it. A concrete comedy of doing rather than saying challenges a host of assumptions about what comedy is and can be. Let's look at 4 of them. Verbal communication is a refinement of a specific behavior, the control of muscles in the throat and mouth to shape expelled air. Speaking relies on an essential but also extremely narrow band of our evolution. Doing draws from a much wider behavioral set. Doing is the body negotiating the physical world. Doing has a far greater capacity to engage the invention of behavior. By emphasizing doing rather than saying, concrete comedy taps more of our animality, our whole selves, brain and body both. Foregrounding comedy's behavioral essence in this way is entirely appropriate. The medium for comedy isn't paint or film or music or writing. The medium is us, what we do and the way we do it. Really, when you think about it, it's amazing that it took as long as it did for someone like Karl Valentin to come along. Conventional histories of comedy define performing in terms of immediacy, the direct correspondence between the comic impulse and its presentation before an audience. But there's no reason why the duration between these need be brief. The span of a gesture can be much longer, hours, days, months, years, a lifetime, and still express comic intent. If comedy is really your aim, there's no particular reason to restrict the synapse of time between conception and delivery. A comedy, which can be a very deliberated, constructed thing, isn't any less comedic for taking 10 years to complete. If instantaneity and immediacy aren't essential to the definition of comic performance, it follows that the presence of an audience no longer defines its beginning and end. The comic performer really only needs an audience's attention at the right moments, those that communicate comic intent. The whole concept of comic performance gets redefined. The communication of comic intent need not be limited to live performance, nor indeed be animate at all. Heard for the 5th time, is a funny line still funny? A funny thing done stays funny, since a comedy of doing engages behavior, what we do and the way we do it. A funny thing done bypasses language. A funny thing done rewards repeated viewings, because in it we detect animal mystery. We never get to the bottom of it, because we never get to the bottom of us. Karl Valentin's groundbreaking approach liberated comedy from the performing arts. Whether he released a genie or the idea was in the air, comedies expressed via material culture have since shown up in every area of communication, in art, architecture, advertising, fashion, music, and showbiz. A concrete comedy has proven a big and lasting idea that, just like its mainstream counterpart, accepts the imprint of as many sensibilities as there are practitioners of it.